Hi everyone. Believe it or not, we're moving on to the last two lectures of this module, or rather the last two lectures with new content on this module. So this lecture is meant to cover the class material for the 1st of December. The next lecture for the 3rd of December will be an update of the material I discussed a few weeks ago about the history of academic geography in Ireland up to the 1970s. And after that point, that's it. There's probably going to be 3 classes of revision content, 3 classes of exam preparation. So revision and exam preparations, not 3 of revision, 3 of exam preparations, 3 classes left with revision and exam preparation. So yeah, I don't know about the final week of semester. Sorry, take off that noise. I don't know about the final week of semester. There'll definitely be a class on Monday. I know apparently Nessa tells me that's Christmas Day, but that class will be over by 11. So you'll have a long run at Christmas Day if you are in on that day. I don't know about the Wednesday class that week, if that's going to go ahead or not on campus. So as I say, the big hope as of now is that I will be in Maynooth for the last 2 weeks. There will be at least one in-class exercise in the second last week of the semester. So this is the plan as of now, but you know what happens with plans. And last 2 weeks, definitely be class, all going well, in hopefully class on campus. On the Monday and the Wednesday of the second last week, definitely class on the Monday of the last week of the semester. I don't know about, I'd have trouble myself getting in for Wednesday at 9. That I'm still not driving yet, so it's kind of and the on-campus accommodation closes after the Monday, so I'm not so sure about whether I'll be in on for the Friday class, or sorry, the Wednesday class. Good God, I've lost my mind. The Wednesday 9 class, but yeah, I don't know if anyone really wants to come in for a 9 o'clock class on a Wednesday in the last week of the semester. So we'll see anyway. That's the general plan as of now. So today I'm looking at critical geography. So this is the last in a 5-lecture series looking at the geographies of postmodernity, the geographies of the 21st century, for want of a better word. Remember that term. So the geographies of the 21st century. As always, plenty of relevant readings there. I would definitely say at this stage of the semester, if you're trying to listen to this at the end of November or at the start of December, at this stage you're probably slap bang in the middle of big deadlines. Of course, you have the most important deadline of all, the big assignment for Approaches to Human Geography coming up on the 3rd of December. So yeah, I can sort of see if you can't be doing readings at the moment, but try to catch up on them. Try to catch up on them later in December if you can. This isn't something you want to be doing or trying to catch up on a day or 2 days before the exam in January. And there's some other readings. You know what? Definitely try to read Mark's chapter 2 from Human Geography, because that's a good summary of the module. Okay, so we're moving on to critical geographies, which is another of the new strands running through the geographies of postmodernity, or the geographies of the 21st century. Critical geographies, in a way, you could almost say, even though we still have Marxist people who, like David Harvey, who would still view themselves as out and out Marxist geographies, critical geographies is probably, in some ways, the natural heir of Marxist geography. It's very left-leaning, very much into oppositional politics, and very much focused on issues to do with marginalization and inequality. So, as Mary Gilmartin says in the Placing Critical Geographies book, critical geography, in a broader sense, is concerned with socio-geographical change and with combating exploitation and oppression at a variety of scales, a variety of geographical scales there, I would presume. So what does critical geographies or critical human geography involve? It involves opposition to unequal and oppressive power struggles, a commitment to social justice and transformative politics, and also the development and application of critical theories. So as such, there is going to be a strong theoretical dimension. Now, just to note, we're in postmodernity. So it won't be the case of trying to develop the big theories, the global theories, the meta-narratives that you would have associated with, say, Marxist thought, Marxism. But it is about critical theories. And as such, it's part of this process of this growing overlap, growing level of interdisciplinarity, a growing level of coming together with critical thinkers from other social sciences. The one thing I'll say here, I'll just say this from the get-go, don't confuse critical geographies with critical thinking. At least critical thinking the way I would interpret it. Critical thinking, if you're asked to think critically for an approaches human geography exam, again, as I've said to you loads of times, is about looking at both sides of an argument, both sides of a statement, looking at arguments for the statement, arguments against. So it's weighing up arguments for and against. Critical geographies, you don't have that particular dimension. It's very much wedded into a left-wing perspective, and there's definitely no attempt here to try and reconcile more left-wing perspectives with perspectives from the right of the political spectrum, as we'll see later. So critical geography, as it says, involves studying and changing the social, cultural, economic, and political relations that create uneven geographies, unequal geographies, and exploitative geographies. The shared ideological stance is to try and bring about a more just world, involving a shared commitment to expose the socio-spatial processes that reproduce inequalities between people and places. And as such, critical geography is, in a way, it's an approach to human geography. In a way, it's like an umbrella approach. I'll talk more about this idea of an umbrella approach probably at the end of the module. Or sorry, it will be almost the end of the module, the end of this lecture. So critical geographies as an umbrella concept or umbrella approach brings together people from different geographical approaches. So definitely Marxism, definitely Marxist geographies, feminist geographies, post-structural geographies, and probably you could add in post-colonial geographies as well. So in a way, it's probably could be looked on as an umbrella approach for people from all these approaches who would see themselves as being very much to the left of the political spectrum, which, given the nature of these approaches, would largely include most geographers associated with these approaches. So, as it says there, like a lot of postmodern geography, extremely diverse in its formulation. So it's drawing on a wide range of different philosophies, theories, and methodologies. And all these different theories and methodologies come into critical geographies through different routes, either the Marxist dimension, the feminist dimension, post-colonial dimension, or the post-structural dimension. Now, how does critical geographies differ from Marxist geography? And this is according to the Thinking Geographically book. It says much contemporary critical human geography, though not all of it, is fundamentally different from the more homogeneous radical geography practiced in the late 1960s and 1970s. As such, structural and material accounts. Now, structural and material, a lot of times when we refer to structural and material accounts, we're probably, when that term's used, that's a reference back to Marxist geography, Marxist geography of the 1970s. Structural and material accounts have been complemented and in many places or instances replaced by positions more sensitive to human agency and questions of culture. So you're seeing kind of a move away from the more kind of deterministic, for want of a better word, approaches of Marxist geography, where everything was seen to be related back to the structures of capitalism, to, as it says, there are positions that are more sensitive to human agency. And human agency, this would tie in more with geographical approaches such as humanistic geography, or indeed emotional geographies and questions of culture. So you're seeing a more nuanced in a ways, there's certain overlaps with Marxist geography, but it's a more nuanced Marxist geography. It's a Marxist geography that does also take account of the dimension of human agency. Now, you might remember when I talked to you back 2 weeks ago, when we were looking at locality studies, new regional geography, critical realism, we made the point that that if you look back at those approaches from the 1980s, 1990s, you can see that this is part, or I wouldn't say the culmination, it's part of a process that's been ongoing since the work done by people in the locality studies tradition and new regional geography. This attempt to bring together more structural accounts of human geography associated more with Marxism and accounts of human geography that are more focused on human agency. So trying to tie together the different focuses on structures and on human agency. And you'll see this in the work of Dorian Massey. So I don't know if you might remember when I was talking in that recorded lecture, I said how the work of people like Dorian Massey was almost like a bridge between what went before in human geography and what went after, namely the rise of the geographies of postmodernity. So that locality studies, new regional geography tradition, you could almost see as a bridging point between the geographies leading up to the 1970s, 1980s, and the geographies of the 21st century. So there's a number of key themes in critical geographies. The first key theme looks at the role of capital. So there is an overlap with Marxist geography, but looks at how a focus on the impacts of the capitalist system can be complemented by also focusing on other dimensions such as lifestyle and culture. So this is called the enculturing capital tradition. So it's where you add a cultural lifestyle dimension to the more traditional Marxist perspectives, or the more traditional outlook associated with Marxist geography. The other key theme running through critical geographies looks at the different axes of power and difference that create social and economic divisions. And this tradition is sometimes referred to as geographies of domination and resistance. So I'll look at these two different themes in a little bit of detail in the next few slides. The key theme for critical geographers, as is suggested there, is how inequality is spatialized. In other words, looking at the geographical dimensions of inequality, how geography plays a role in this. So the enculturing capital tradition, as the slide there suggests, effectively what you're trying to do is extend on the traditional viewpoints of Marxist geography by adding in other dimensions, such as concerns with lifestyle and culture. So the focus is you can get a better understanding of how capitalism helps to produce and reproduce social inequalities by also focusing on the cultural politics of identity. And this is an approach that particularly became evident in the work done on urban gentrification, but also rural gentrification, particularly in the 1990s. So what we see within culturing capital tradition is a shift in emphasis, as it says there, from an examination of the role of capital in shaping society to a more broader focus, looking at the multiple axes of power and difference that help create social and economic divides. So as it says there, as such, the structural material accounts that we traditionally associate, particularly in geography, human geography and Marxist geography, these accounts have been either complemented or replaced, as I said before, by positions more sensitive to human agency and questions of culture. Now, one of the people especially associated with this approach, he passed away a few years ago, is Neil Smith, who was a student of David Harvey. And Neil Smith definitely comes from that Marxist tradition, but you do see him engage more with cultural themes, cultural identity themes, as his work develops in the 1990s and 2000s. So As he says, like Neil Smith would generally take the viewpoint that this marks an extension of Marx's geographical work. So his attitude, or his argument, was the rapid deepening of Marxist research was therefore matched by an even more rapid broadening as Marxist work explored and eventually fused with all kinds of social theory. So in the mindsets of Neil Smith and David Harvey, what you're getting here isn't a replacement of Marxist geography, it's a broadening of the viewpoints of Marxist geography. And it's an extension where you're getting different forms of social theory now being added to, extended to, as an extension of the Marxist approaches. Now, one of the key themes running through this, and this is a key theme running through a lot of postmodern geography, themes of difference and otherness. I'll come back to this again when I move on in more detail when I move on to the next key theme running through critical geographies. For people in this tradition, themes of difference and otherness, this additional focus on the themes of difference and otherness is seen to be an important addition to more traditional geographical frameworks such as Marxist geography. Themes of difference and otherness is seen as crucial in making sense of the dialectics of social change. So instead of just focusing on class as a category, you're now adding new categories such as race, sexuality, gender, and age in terms of the different frameworks or the different research work. And as I said before, you look at intersectionality in relation to feminist geography. You're seeing a similar trend in relation to radical feminist geography. Feminist geography, as I said in last week's lecture, feminist geography evolved, and now you're with this focus on intersectionality, you're seeing the traditional focus within feminist geography and gender being supplemented by trying to see how gender inequalities link into other forms of inequalities, namely those related to race, sexuality, age, imperialism, and also class. Neil Smith's basic argument is the new form of capitalism. I talked about this 2 weeks ago when we looked at the locality studies tradition. He says, advanced flexible capitalism associated with the global economic restructuring that took place from the 1970s and 1980s onwards. He says it feeds on the perpetuation and reinvention of inequality at different scales. So in a way, this is an overlap with one of the big ideas or the big concepts in Marxist geography, geographically uneven development. The idea that for the capitalist system to be maintained and to be reinvented, you need to have a degree of inequality built into the system. You need to have inequality built into the system. You need to have spaces that are less developed than others, which means you can move investments to those places. Now, sorry, if I'm just going to lay the cat through the door here. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry folks, the cat has entered the building, so all's okay again. So in this enculturing capital tradition, cultural representations are seen to be important because these can be used to exploit these inequalities and further increase the level of these inequalities. Now, Neil Smith, as a geographer, is a student of David Harvey, underwent the same academic political transformation in the 1970s as his mentor David Harvey did, this shift to Marxist geography. And his work is particularly focused on the uneven production of space, particularly in urban areas. Along with David Harvey, very much focused on, a geographer coming from the Marxist tradition, as it says there, aiming to unravel the socio-spatial logics of capitalism, focusing on the issue of uneven development, and very much based on the Marxist approach. But as his work moves into the 1990s to 2000s, it's a Marxist approach that is more and more sensitive to issues to do with cultural identity and cultural politics. Now, one of his most significant pieces of work is the work he did on urban gentrification or inner city gentrification, the concept of the rent gap. In Uneven Development, which is probably his most, popular book, or the book he's most associated with. In Uneven Development, he talks about the geographical or spatial dimensions of uneven development that can be linked back to the workings of capitalism. And in this, and again, this of course relates back to what I talked about. When was this? Oh, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, when we looked at Marx's geography, right back at the start of November. This links back to the concept of geographically uneven development. So Neil Smith definitely agrees with this. He suggests geographically uneven processes of development are seen as necessary components of the capitalist system. Without a degree of inequality, without a difference between better off places and less well off places, the capitalist system cannot be maintained. You need to have this geographically uneven development. A concept or idea that goes all the way back to Marxist thinkers in the early 1900s, such as Rosa Luxemburg, the idea that you needed underdeveloped spaces for the capitalist system to be maintained, underdeveloped spaces where enterprises, industries where businesses, where capital could be moved, especially at times of recession. In the book New Urban Frontier, he suggests in that book that there is when looking at gentrification, he does see that as a knock-on effects. He does see gentrification as a knock-on effect of the workings out of the capitalist system. So he says it's basically another case of investment moving to underdeveloped spaces, investment looking for new sites of investment. So this time, instead of moving to greenfield sites, investment, he said, in the 1990s with this process of inner city gentrification is probably moving more to brownfield sites that had already been developed, but which had fallen into a period of dereliction. So this phase of gentrification effectively saw another phase of capitalism where capitalist investments once suddenly started pouring into inner city areas looking to develop apartment blocks, looking for new forms of profit making. But he also suggests that there was a cultural dimension here. It was also linked to change in consumer tastes. It was also linked to the fact that people were now more willing, in the 1990s and 2000s, they were now more willing to live in apartment blocks, live in inner city apartments. That the general trend that had been seen in terms of urban house preferences of wanting more and more space, this trend was sort of, especially for younger people, this trend was sort of weakening in the 1990s. People were no longer in places like America looking for their white picket fences, their house, front garden, white picket fence around it. There was a growing demand for residence spaces in the inner city, for apartments in the inner city, probably helped in part by sitcoms such as Friends, where the idea that apartments might be just somewhere you stayed for maybe a year or two. Now people were probably starting to see them as potentially more permanent places of residence. Now, the condition of postmodernity, we talked about this before, so I'll gloss over this slide. So this is another example of this tradition of enculturing capitalism. Another element of this tradition where people like David Harvey and Neil Smith don't fully see Marxist approaches as being totally replaced by the ideas of postmodernity. They generally view it as Marxist geography, Marxist approach still remaining, but getting new dimensions added to them. So basically, in Harvey's book, The Condition of Postmodernity, which I referred to a few weeks ago, Harvey suggested that it was last week. He says I keep changing my mind. Yeah, it was the lecture from 2 weeks ago. So in this book, he says postmodernity, postmodernism can be used for radical ends as part of a liberation style. I'll say that, I can't pronounce the other word, politics. So basically, as I suggested 2 weeks ago, Harvey has a lot of issues with postmodernity as an idea, and he outlines some of those ideas. But he also says that, yes, some elements of postmodernity and postmodernism can be useful. But in Harvey's mindset, David Harvey still remains a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist Geographer. In Harvey's mindset, he says, look, you can add new dimensions to Marxist geography by taking some of the best ideas from postmodernism. So he says the focus on difference in others. He says this leads to suggestions that you can add race, gender, and religion. You can focus on other factors in addition to class within the traditional Marxist frameworks. He says also important to focus on cultural practices and discourses. Also important, he says, there's a sense that geography is taken more seriously in terms of real geographies of social action. And the last point, as I suggested 2 weeks ago, his argument that, yeah, maybe the idea that you have one big theory that explains everything fully, he says, maybe that's not so much of a thing as I thought it was maybe in the early 1970s. He says big theories, like big theories like Marxism, and obviously he's putting his emphasis on Marxism, says big theories should be viewed, while they mightn't answer everything, while they mightn't be 100% giving you the full answer. He says big theories like Marxism, he says, still have a value. They're attempts to come to terms with truth. And he suggests instead of getting rid of Marxist frameworks, namely historical materialism, what you should have is a renewal of this, with these different additions being added to it, as opposed to trying to totally remove the historical materialist frameworks associated with Marxist geography. Now, geographies of domination and resistance. This is the other second key strand running through critical geographies, or running through critical geographies in the 2010s. So in this view, space, and remember we've talked on this module a lot about space as a concept, the different understandings or approaches you can have to space. When we looked at spatial science, obviously space was a big concept. It was this container view where space was almost like a neutral thing. It was just a blank page almost on which you could measure and develop theories about the impacts of distance and movements and so on. Later on, when we move on to Marxist geography, humanistic geography, we start to see different understandings of space, the idea that space can be socially constructed. In the views of critical geographers, space can be viewed as a crucial means through which social identities and distinctions are created and maintained. So they refer there to things such as a spatialized politics of identity or identity politics of place. So they talk about how certain socio-spatial, that's a mixture between social and geographical, how certain socio-spatial processes can be used to maintain the oppression of particular groups, marginalized groups, or sometimes, as they're increasingly referred to in the postmodern tradition, other groups, OTHER groups, other groups. But it also talks about how these processes of domination can be resisted through transgressive acts. So this idea of having geographies of domination and resistance. The big focus here is on marginal groups, on others, and looks at how otherness can be constructed in specific places and times. So how otherness, this concept of otherness, it basically refers to how certain groups, certain marginal groups, are looked on as different to the mainstream, and how this sense of these groups being different, how this can be maintained and constructed in specific places, but also at specific times. This focus on other groups is there to challenge dominant analyses and discourses within society, but it's also there to call for a greater degree of sensitivity to these other groups, these marginal groups who are generally viewed as being oppressed by society. So the accounts in this tradition have political value, and they aim to provide critical knowledge to confront spatial hegemony, so dominant practices and processes across geographical space. One of the really interesting pieces of work done in this tradition is done by a man called Tim Creswell. Now, I hope all of you have heard of Tim Creswell at this stage. If you haven't heard of Tim Creswell, where have you been for the last 3 months? If you haven't heard of Tim Creswell, you need to start looking at the reading list. So Tim Creswell is the author of what I consider to be, in my opinion, the most useful textbook for this module. Now, he's not just a historian of geography, he's also a geographer in his own right. And in 1996, he produced a book called In Place, Out Place, which is very much in keeping with this tradition of geographies of domination and resistance. So in Place, Out Place, Creswell studies the way in which domination is maintained, hegemony is maintained. And he talks about certain cultural ideologies that are place inscribed. So basically, that the idea that you go to certain places and certain ways of behaving, of speaking, are almost taken for granted, that you're socialized in these places to act and behave in certain ways, but also looking at how this domination can be resisted, all through the production of space. So as he suggests, in terms of looking at the geographies of domination, he says people can be socialized into understanding when someone or something is out of place. So it gets to a point, it's almost like he's making the point that it's almost it's so inscribed into everyday life, into everyday ways of thinking, that this almost is taken for granted. It's almost second nature. So you see a certain group of people in a place and you kind of go, oh, they don't belong here. What are they doing? Should we ring for the guards or something? You see certain things taking place, acts taking place in the place, and say, no, these are things that shouldn't be done here. These are acts that shouldn't be done here. A very simplistic one, a library. Going into a library and starting a sing-song. Now, there's rules in a library, but you don't need to know the rules to know that starting a sing-song on the top floor of the library, unless it's the last day before Christmas and everyone's chill. Oh, I hate that term, chilled out. Oh, bloody hippies. Unless everyone's so chilled out that they're all there, let's just finish off the last hour before the library closes and we'll have a sing-song. What a waste of an hour in the library, folks. So you know that certain behavior is accepted in the library, certain behavior isn't. You know when people are out of place. So if you see a few 5-year-olds or 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds running around screaming blue murder, you will almost instinctively know that these kids do not belong here. If you see some guy playing a guitar and singing along badly on the top floor, you'll know, okay, this shouldn't be happening in the library. So the idea that, and you don't need to look at the rules. This is the big idea of Creswell. You don't need to look at the rules. Through a process of socialization, you know instinctively that, okay, in terms of the way this library is organized, in terms of the way this library is maintained, those 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds do not belong here. That guy is singing at the top of his voice very badly on the guitar on the top floor of the library. That guy shouldn't be there. If he should be there, he should be reading his Creswell book or his Nike and Jeffrey book and answering a wonderful writing his big GY305 written assignment, or doing maybe a short online assignment. But Creswell says this process of domination is not one way. He says domination can be resisted. He says marginalized groups can use multiple tactics of transgression to try and break this domination. So you could think of, okay, these poor 2-year-olds are being marginalized, so maybe they'll join together with the 1-year-olds and they'll just try and take over the library, or they'll sit down and they'll have a sit-down protest in front of the library. Maybe that guy singing badly with the guitar might decide a process. He might just take a stand and engage in some form of protest, which ultimately means that you can't bloody well read your library books in peace. So there can be acts of transgression. Different tactics of transgression can be used, forms of protest maybe by marginalized groups to challenge the dominant kind of thought processes relating to certain places. But it's not a one-way, two-way process either. The dominant groups aren't just going to go and say, oh, great, the 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds are blocking up the front of the library. It's great now that no students can go into the library, even though there's loads of deadlines coming up. Gosh, that's brilliant. Go them. No, the dominant groups will resist these acts of transgression, and they'll find some ways. So in that case, the head of the library will just say, okay, fair enough. He'll get on the phone, ring all the mammies, and the mammies will drag the 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds home and doing much touching. He'll ring the music society, and the music society will arrest the guy with the guitar for playing badly, and he'll be also out of the library. So you can have domination and transgression, but transgressive acts in turn can be resisted by the dominant groups. No one wants to give up power, guys. No one wants to give up power. Now, feminist geography and postmodernity. Feminist geography is another of the key strands running through critical geographies. I talked a bit about the new strands in feminist geography in last week's set of lectures. So feminist geography, like Marxist geography, it does have its issues with postmodernity. So it suggests that postmodernism, according to Creswell, postmodernism has made it difficult to pursue theoretical and political agendas. And one of the big issues for feminist geography with postmodernity, he says, it allows men to dabble playfully. I love that phrase. Allows men to dabble playfully in feminist theories without really committing to the full consequences of a feminist critique. So it means basically all these male academics are, oh, feminist geography, oh, they're great ideas. Oh, we'll take some of these ideas, add them to our work. But they're not really trying to do much to change the world in terms of gender relations. As Creswell notes, he says, some feminists would argue that postmodernism is largely a men's game. So they're saying, look, we had what happened in geography in the 70s and 80s, and we were making some progress with the rise of radical feminist geography and the later developments in feminist geography, and now all of a sudden you bring in postmodernism, and some feminist geographers would probably see postmodernism as basically an attempt by a sort of an Empire State Strikes Back, almost like geographies of domination and resistance, an attempt to try to maintain the male dominance of academic geography, potentially. Definitely have a read of what Creswell says there. It's really interesting. Others suggest that postmodernity has values in terms of feminist thinking. So some would see postmodernity as linking with feminist thought in different ways. First of all, critiquing modernist thought, critiquing what they see as the masculinist perspectives of Enlightenment thought and modernism. Second of all, critiquing the concept of a detached other, the idea that third of all, arguing that researchers cannot detach themselves from their context. So yeah, that's those points linked together, the idea that a researcher can be a detached observer, a detached other, someone who can just look at a topic without having any form of emotional or human engagement with the topic. So the idea that researchers are themselves products of their own contexts. The fourth point, postmodernity and feminist geography or feminist thought have a shared suspicion of the notion that academic writing can be transparent. And last of all, they both seek to oppose dualistic thinking, so differences between us and them, male and female, our group and other groups. Now, feminist geography intersectionality. One of the things pointed out by Creswell is this growing recognition that some people see feminist geography as more of a Western concern within the discipline of geography. And in this chapter, or in this section of Creswell's book, he talks about different perspectives on feminist geography, or different ideas that might be taken in relation to feminist geography in other parts of the world. Another dimension is the intersectional dimension, the growing recognition of difference as a concept. The idea that women are, of course, women, but they're also come from different class groups. They have different forms of sexuality, and they come from different races or ethnic groups. So the idea that women as a group, they're not a homogeneous group. You can have white women, black women, Latinas. You can have heterosexual women, lesbian women, and you can have women from middle class groups and working class groups. And the experiences of all these different groups of women, particularly the experiences of inequality, will be very different. So this moves Creswell on to talk about the concept of intersectionality. And Creswell suggests, he draws on the ideas of Kimberley Crenshaw. He suggests that intersectionality emerged first of all from a specific recognition of the entanglement of race and gender within black feminism. So as he suggests, axes of gender intersect with axes of race, class, sexuality, age, and other forms of identity, which are shaped by power relations and in turn act to shape power relations. So there are a number of very interesting dimensions running through critical geography. Critical geography is adding new dimensions to traditional more left-wing geographical frameworks, such as those associated with Marxist geography and radical feminist geography. So the 1970s and 1980s radical feminist geography and Marxist geography. Now, what about critical geographies? As I said, I would look on critical geographies, in my view, as the closest thing we have to a dominant approach within human geography. I know other geographers would differ. Some would say, oh, maybe it's applied geography. But if you look at where power lies within global academic geography, if you look at the most recent appointments to geography departments in places like the Republic of Ireland, you are seeing a strong dominance of critical geographers in these different areas. So in some parts of the world, at least some parts of the world, in my view, critical geographies, and again, to call it an approach is probably stretching things a bit. It's an umbrella of different approaches. But what links them together is this, effectively, a left-wing political perspective, or a perspective highlighting questions to do with inequality from a socio-spatial perspective and trying to bring about change. So critical geographies as an umbrella for different approaches is probably the closest thing we have to a dominant paradigm or approach. So could we say that Kuhn's model still has maybe a little bit of a hint of a degree of relevance or resonance for what's happening in modern day geography? Could we say actually maybe what we've seen, there's different ways of looking at it. Mark's perspective, Mark Spile's perspective, is basically what we have today is basically the culmination of the process of the last few decades of greater and greater fragmentation within academic human geography. Now, I agree there is fragmentation in academic human geography, but to some extent, if you look at power within geography departments, within global geography, to some extent, I think potentially what we've seen, say, between the 1980s and the 2000s is probably a very long paradigm shift period where you had the end of the dominance of spatial science and perhaps also the end of the dominance of Marxist geography. And basically, geographers have been scrambling around over the last few decades for a new approach. And maybe critical geographies is the new dominant approach. Maybe we have had the paradigm shift, and we now have a new paradigm, maybe a super paradigm, because as I said, it's more of an umbrella for different approaches rather than maybe a standalone approach. So as Berg and others note in the book, I forgot the title, but it's the top book on the reading list. Critical geography is prominent in the United Kingdom and the United States, with practitioners of critical geography awarded professional recognition and advancement. In all, I think if you look at most professors of human geography today, if you look at who's held positions of power within groups such as the International Geographical Union, you will see a dominance of critical geographers within those groups. Now, there are risks of becoming the dominant approach or paradigm. There is advantages. The one advantage is that, you might remember I was talking about Eston Evans and Jones Hughes in Irish geography in the 50s and 60s. If you're the dominant group, if the positions of power are held by your particular approach or your particular umbrella approach, if you have the positions of power, then you have a lot. Power effectively allows you to do things. If you have the power, you can effectively decide who the next generation of geographers are. You'll have a lot of power in terms of decision making when it comes to hiring new geographers. So if there's a lot of critical geographers sitting on interview panels, there's a good chance that the new hires will be largely also critical geographers. So there is an advantage for your approach or your worldview in being the dominant approach, but there are risks associated with that. The risks of having a dominant approach is that other ways of doing geography can get marginalized, and that sometimes kind of risks. And sometimes the risks can relate back to the approach itself. Maybe, as with critical geographies, there's good things about the approach, but maybe there's other things that could be problematic. Critical geographies does involve a growing level of closeness between geographers, or rather critical geographers, and people doing similar work in the other social sciences. Now, growing levels of interdisciplinarity on one level can be seen as a positive thing, but if geography becomes too similar to the social sciences, maybe you'll reach a point in time where people will say, do we need geography anymore? Or do we need human geography more specifically? Isn't that just part of this big, wide umbrella group of social sciences? So as it says there, critical geographies as well. One of the points, and I probably shouldn't have made this point when I was talking about post-colonial geography, one of the main critiques of academic geography, more or less over the last 100 years ago, has been its dominance by male geographers and its dominance by middle-class geographers. Well, another critique offered against academic geography has been the dominance of academic geography by Anglo-American geography, by geographers coming from the English and American traditions. Now, critical geography as such is as much dominated by Anglo-American geography as earlier approaches such as, or paradigms such as regional geography, spatial science, and so on. So, as Mary Gilmartin notes, Nature Inform and much geographic research in Ireland has a strong commitment to spatial justice, whether through its attempts to describe and highlight inequalities, or through applied work that attempts to directly or indirectly influence policy. The commitment to place is a component of the best work of political geographers in and on Ireland. Yet much of this work receives a limited audience outside Ireland. So that's highlighting the fact that basically we're still at a point in time where there's a lot of good work being done in countries like Ireland, other countries around the world, but still, ultimately, the United States of America, the United Kingdom, even in this new phase of geography, these countries still have a lot of power and influence in terms of which types of geography gets the most attention, gets the biggest audience. One of the big problems with critical geographies could be the politics of critical geographies. Now, there's always been a strong political dimension to academic geography, and it's varied from time to time. It's fair to say in the late 1800s, early 1900s, probably into the mid 1900s, academic geography, the political kind of viewpoint of academic geography was more conservative, more right-wing. So we'll see that obviously with the environmental determinist approach, where people working in that tradition saw their role in part as being there to sustain the imperialist practices of their own states. That conservative strand also ran through regional geography. It wasn't kind of tying in with imperialism at that stage, but a lot of regional geography had a very kind of conservative, was underpinned by a conservative worldview, which basically effectively saw change as social change as a bad thing. And generally, there was almost a reactionary politics associated with the work of people like Karl Sauer. Basically, they wanted to go back to the good old days of the homogeneous regions. You can debate about the politics of spatial science, but generally, definitely early spatial science work, you did have that. Very strong focus on industrial location, on interests to do with, on topics that would be of more interest to business owners as opposed to the general public. Now, obviously, when you moved into the 60s, you did see a shift in work, in thinking within quantitative geography and spatial science. So, academic geography in the period leading up to the 1970s was probably more right-wing than left-wing. Now, that changed effectively with the emergence of Marxist geography and radical feminist geography in the 1970s and 1980s. And at this point, a lot of academic geography in certain parts of the world, including the Republic of Ireland, is now very left-wing in scope and in focus. The one problem is sometimes this left-wing orientation doesn't involve a lot of critical thinking. There is a danger that, and this is a danger of having a dominant approach, that you end up in a sort of an echo chamber where anything your side does is great, anything the other side does is terrible. So that's the danger of the echo chamber, that, okay, so you could have two presentations, one done by another critical geographer, and it's not great. The guy's basically had a hard night the night before, and he's written up his paper literally in the space of a few minutes before the conference. And it's a bit messy, but because they're from your worldview, you go, God, that was a great paper, brilliant paper. And then someone comes from a more centrist or right center political world perspective, and they present their paper, and they might have spent months in it, and it's fairly well developed now. You mightn't agree with the politics, but it might be a well-written paper. But in your views, oh, that's a terrible paper. That was an awful mess. So one of the problems with, if the politics overwhelms geography, one of the problems if the politics overwhelms geography is you end up in an echo chamber, where you're only going to listen to people from your own side. If there's a conference on, you'll go to geographers who share your worldview. You won't go to paper sessions organized by geographers. And it might be right-wing geographers. It might be just other geographers who aren't fully blown geographers, aren't fully blown allies of your particular approach or your particular worldview. So there is a danger that you just end up listening to yourself. You just have this echo chamber. And one of the things I want to get across in this module is no one has 100% the truth. And in a way, I'm a bit postmodern there in a way, but no approach is 100% perfect. No approach is 100% flawed. Even bloody environmental determinism had the glimmers of some good ideas. The idea that nature-society relations should be the basis for a geographical subject. So, yeah. So the danger of the echo chamber. Now, a lot of the work in postmodern geography, post-structural geography, particularly post-colonial geography, talks about stereotypes and warns of the danger of stereotyping marginalized groups or other groups. The problem is that sometimes you get that same level of stereotyping sometimes with academic, not just academic geographers. You see it in other forms of in other avenues of academic life as well, that sometimes the critiques or the discussions, the challenges offered by critical geographers to people, say particularly from a more right-wing perspective, sometimes they're it's like they're not even bothering. Sometimes it just gets into stereotyping. So oh, if someone comes in with a right-wing view, it's like they're totally wrong. We're right, we're left-wing, we're cool. We're not going to engage with that. So, for instance, in the tweet there from Trinity College, wonderful geography department, but like a lot of departments, quite left-wing in terms of the political perspective. So they talk about righty economists and the flat earth politics of liberalism. So sometimes critical geographers, postmodern geographers, post-structural geographers, they'll talk a lot about the dangers of stereotyping. But sometimes if you look at them, particularly say on social media, sometimes they're as bad at stereotyping and generalizing as the right-wing, the more right-wing or centre-right academics and politicians that they seek to challenge and to critique. Last issue with critical geographies, and indeed a lot of what's happening in postmodern academia, there's not been any real response offered to the rise of right-wing populist movements. Sometimes the critiques of this or the discussions of this can be fairly basic, can be fairly, again, getting into stereotyping. Oh, why did Brexit? Why did the United Kingdom vote for Brexit? Because ultimately, sometimes the argument is, oh, everyone, they're all idiots for doing it. Now, the problem with this is that if you look at the people who voted for Brexit, the people who voted for Donald Trump in the US presidential elections, the people who decided to vote for Boris Johnson over Jeremy Corbyn in the 2019 UK general election, you're looking at people from traditional working class backgrounds. And the very germs of the rise of Marxist geography, and also to radical feminist geography, the germs of the emergence of that was a focus on issues to do with these very same people. So sometimes, I think sometimes some critical geographers, not all of them, but some critical geographers just can't manage to offer any really nuanced take on the rise of political populism. And really, this is something you need to understand if you want to challenge it. Otherwise, you're getting into stereotypes. You're all idiots. You're all racists. Oh, everyone who votes for Trump is everyone who votes for Brexit, they're an idiot. They're a racist. Not everyone who votes for Brexit is an idiot. Not everyone who votes for these things are racist. So you need to actually sometimes almost critical geography, some elements of critical geography or critical social sciences, to some extent, they've actually got to do with critical thinking, saying, hang on a second, what's going wrong here? We started off in the 1970s trying to promote, trying to critique a global capitalist system that is oppressing working class people. And now here we are, some of us, calling out working class people as idiots and racists for maybe voting for Brexit, maybe voting for Boris Johnson, maybe voting for Donald Trump, even bloody well voting for Micheál Martin in some cases. So sometimes the politics can overwhelm critical geographies. And there might be an argument that critical geographies just need to be a little bit more critical, just say, hang on. Is everything we're arguing here totally correct? Is everything that the opposition is arguing totally incorrect? Now, it's not just critical geographies, it's just the way the world has gone. Back in the 1990s, in the glory days of locality studies, of critical realism, of new regional geography, that's what I call music era. In those days, there was a greater degree of consensus. People disagreed, but people could find common ground. It's just, in a way, it could be argued, it's almost kind of symptomatic of the way the world has gone in the last 20, 30 years. And I'm old enough to see that instead of trying to find common ground, people just want to argue and disagree with each other the whole time. Does that bring about any significant change? I leave it up to yourselves, you're smart. But ultimately, I don't think it does really, to be honest. Have a look at others talking about critical geopolitics. We talked about critical geopolitics in the lecture, in the last set of lectures as part of post-structural geographies. So Have a look at others talks about critical geopolitics. So in talking about this, and a lot of this, what he says about critical geopolitics, he could probably apply to critical geographies as well. He says, first of all, there's as much of a political agenda here as there was with geopolitics, and indeed much of academic geography, as there was as much a right-wing agenda with geopolitics and much of academic human geography in the late 1800s. So he says, every school has an underlying political agenda that blinkers their worldviews. Critical geopoliticians are almost uniformly anti-globalization and anti-neoliberalism. Now, the one warning he offers is, he says, okay, it may be important to critique those in positions of power. But he says, could be a dangerous game. It's one thing to go, so it's an interesting thing. It's always hard to find a halfway house. In the late 1800s, geographers were doing too much in terms of trying to offer assistance to people in positions of power, to statespeople, particularly in terms of helping to facilitate the imperialist project. Have a look at others suggest that maybe it's on the other side now. Maybe geographers run the risk of leaving themselves out in the cold in terms of being able to influence policy makers, decision makers. So he says, due to the identification with left-wing oppositional politics, they say geographers may struggle to influence decision makers and thus bring about change, because who's going to bring about change? All academics would like to think that they can bring about change, but ultimately the people who do bring about change are the decision makers, the politicians, the civil servants. So in a way, the route to go about bringing about change is to try and influence policymakers. But if you're a geographer, basically sees all centre, not just right-wing politicians, but centre-right politicians or even slightly left-of-centre politicians as wrong, as deluded, as misguided, then funnily enough, people have fairly thin skin. So if a politician is looking at this academic who wants to try to influence them, and they're saying, oh, you guys are terrible, you should be ashamed of yourselves. And they're kind of going, no, I'm a politician. I came into this for the right reasons. I may have a different political outlook to you, but I think I can bring about change. I can make life better for everyone, working class and middle class people. So why are you saying I should be ashamed? Like, why should I listen to you then if you're treating me like that? So have a look at what I say. Is a danger that critical approaches, critical geographies, could become anti-influential outside a small circle of academics, and it could facilitate the marginalization of geography as an academic discipline. So they suggest, you know what, the risk of going too far down this path is that no one starts listening to you anymore. The only people listening to you are your own friends. In a way, it's also something that could be said about using too much jargon in academic work. So there is a danger that suggests about going too far down an oppositional path, that you're not willing to engage in any way with politicians, with decision makers. And the danger there is the only people you're influencing are your own friends, the other critical geographers. And ultimately, the danger there is the policymakers will be listening to economists, they'll be listening to maybe people in political science, they might be listening to other people in other social sciences and sciences, but they might decide, you know what are we getting from the geographers? All we're getting is criticism, critiques, they're giving us nothing, so we'll just ignore them. So it facilitates, according to Have a Look and others, the marginalization of geography as an academic discipline. The last point, and the last danger to be associated potentially with any form of postmodern geographies, including critical geography, the danger that, as I said before, geography becomes another social science. Now, I like the idea, and this is Mark's creation, I have to say, I don't take any claim for this myself, Mark Boyle's, but I like the idea that human geography does form this bridge between the natural sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. That at certain points in time, it's maybe more closely aligned with the natural sciences. at other points in time more closely aligned with the humanities, at other points in time more closely aligned with the social sciences. And different approaches naturally see themselves being more aligned with, say, the humanities. Other approaches see themselves as being more naturally aligned with with the social sciences, and so on. The danger, as I said before, is with growing levels of interdisciplinarity, and particularly when you get to a point in time where maybe a lot of geographers find it much easier to work with other people in sociology, in anthropology, and other social sciences than to do with, say, other geographers who don't share the same political worldview. The danger is that maybe geography over time, as I suggested already, maybe geography over time might just become another social science. That maybe we're going to see a reversal of the trend we've seen in universities and academia more or less from the 1500s up until the mid to late 1900s. So the growing trend in that period was of greater specialization. The creation, first of all, of individual departments, academic departments, and later on, even more specialization. Maybe what we're going to see in relation to the social sciences is, and this is one thing I'd be worried about, is that instead of having standalone geography departments, sociology departments, that over time, all the social sciences, just because of this growing level of interdisciplinarity, all the social sciences just get blurred into one. And maybe the new approaches such as postmodern geography, post-structural geography, critical geographies, maybe these new approaches lend themselves more to this kind of blurring of what we see as pure geography and what we see as general work associated with the social sciences. Anyway, everyone, that's a very long-winded take on critical geographies. Hopefully you'll get a few ideas from this, and I'll leave it there. So this is it. This is the second last official lecture with new content of this module. Just one more to come.